So this paper, which has been written along with Varsha Joshi, late Varsha Joshi, about whom you heard something yesterday, it's on the question of child labor. We go beyond the usual problem of regulating child labor in value chains to consider what is needed to end or eliminate child labor. The reason is that if we look only at the demand side, regulation deals with the demand side, that businesses should not employ child labor. But we don't look at the supply side. Why is child labor forthcoming? Why is there child labor? And how do we change the conditions that create child labor? So I think we think it's inadequate to only look at the demand side, which it is necessary to also go to the supply side of why there is child labor. That is really the motivation for our writing this paper. I won't go into this is based on a lot of work which Varsha and I have done, and also I have done with other researchers, including, unfortunately, another researcher who also died a couple of years before Varsha, Preet Rustagi, who also I worked with her on child labor issues. So it's work over a period of more than 10 years in different parts of India, studying different value chains, most often with the ILO. Most of this work was done with ILO, but some of it with the Freedom Fund or with Save the Children and other such organizations. So we're really putting together the material and the experiences of all of these studies. In talking about the exploitation, okay, we're dealing really with severe forms of exploitation or forms of forced labor or modern slavery. So how can we apply that to child labor? Here we need to make a distinction between two clearly different kinds of child labor, forms of child labor. One is where the child is employed as a wage worker or an employee, however low the wage may actually be. Sometimes it may be just the food, but is not working, but is working as an employee in some fashion or the other. The other one is where the child is a family worker, of course, usually an unpaid family worker. And these two are very different. They cannot be dealt with in the same manner. You cannot have the same, say, the carceral approach or the rescue and punish kind of approach with regard to child employees. You can't use that with regard to child labor working within the family. And child labor working within the family is actually a very, a large part of the total child labor in the world. The latest ILO UNICEF figures give us 72% of child labor being the labor within the family. So obviously you can't deal with labor within the family in the way that you can deal with the employers and when they employ child labor. Now, even this is an undercount because there's a certain section of child labor, largely really girls, who are missed in this counting because these are girls who carry out what are the domestic work within the house. And since they are not included within the UN National Income Statistics System, so they also do not figure in the ILO UNICEF data on child labor. So that's 72%. And of course, I was very surprised when I looked at the ILO data when they said that the majority of child workers are boys. And that's not what I thought, and that's not what I've been seeing. But then when I went through the data and I realized that they really left out a very large portion of what were otherwise also called nowhere children. These are children who are not employed and were not at school. They are really child workers. And this is where my late colleague Preet Rustagi, who did this work with Christopher Lighton, they had these so-called nowhere children, they had them monitored the whole day. And I remember them telling me, our field researchers are saying, look, these children don't do anything. But that's exactly what you have to find out. What is that not doing anything, which they do? Now, what they do is they look after the younger siblings so that both of the parents can go and work and earn an income. So that really is an underestimate of the extent of child labor. Okay, so therefore, we would agree that wage labor is a form of extreme exploitation and will be dealt with in a certain way. It can even be called a form of modern slavery, of course, because the slavery is for a limited period of time, but we cannot include the child labor at home within these categories of slave, bonded, or forced labor. But with regard to these child labor, child home workers, if we may say so, we'll have to also think about how to go beyond legal interventions and regulation to include development interventions which are necessary to end child labor. Now, I'll just take an aside on one question because it often comes up in debates, and Bolivia actually made it part of their law, which it said that it is part of our Andean culture that children work with their parents, and so we don't think it is necessary to end child labor. I'll give you a quote from in Andean society, since very young, the children worked with their parents in the field and all this, and this was not negatively associated with this. There was no negativity. It's true. We have all gone through history. All countries have gone through a history where knowledge was basically acquired through children working with their parents. These are the ways in which, as apprentices in craft guilds. Now, this is the way in which knowledge was traditionally passed on from one generation to the next. But we now have come to a situation, which is what capitalism has brought, where we do require a certain amount of formal education, of literacy and of numeracy in order to be able to function in this capitalist world system as a worker. In fact, it has now gone even beyond that as the COVID-19 lockdowns and all the processes that have followed after that have shown. Now it is even important to be literate in a digital manner. If you're not digitally literate, you cannot really function today. Even children cannot go to school if they don't have a smartphone. This is what India is finding out to their cost, that the poorer children have just had no schooling for the last year or year and a half. So we can't think of it in the manner in which it used to be done in the old days. There was a history where knowledge was basically passed on within the family, but now we've gone to another form of way in which knowledge is acquired. Now, coming to the value chains, we look at both domestic and global value chains, and we look at where there have been successes and what are the limitations of these interventions. Now, when you look at garment factories in India, or even in Bangladesh for that matter, you will find a sign outside the gate saying children below 18 not allowed. That's because of all of the campaigns that have been carried on child labor. So at the factory level, they have actually eliminated, largely, not completely, largely eliminated child labor from within the factory. But that does not mean they have ended those child workers from being child labor. So they have been shifted to other locations. They have been shifted to more remote locations where it is difficult to monitor them. And secondly, they have even been shifted within the family, so that now even the child labor working for global brands is now family labor and not factory labor. There's another way in which they have been dealt with, and that is by starting community centers. So what they have found is that, of course, where you have women working along with their as home workers, very often this is associated with child labor, where the children work with their mother or their parents at home before school, after school, or not going to school. But certain of the brands, it started with Gap. It also started in Pakistan in the stitching centers. What they did was to set up community centers where the women could come and work. And along with that, set up a manner of child care so that the little children could be taken care of while the parents or the mothers were working. If you don't take care of that, if you don't make an arrangement for the child care, what we have seen is that the little children get brought to this work, and then you have an older girl looking after them while the mothers are working. So the community centers have helped to remove or eliminate child labor from the value chains. But as I mentioned, it has been found that sometimes they have been displaced and had to even seek further kind of even worse work than what they were doing in the within the factories. So that's why the importance of saying that it's not enough to just end child labor in the value chain. We need to be able to end the supply of child labor. For that, there's an important kind of intervention, which really becomes very important as the factor in child labor, and that is increasing adult wages. Now, most analyses show that the major reason why children are put to work is because of the inadequacy of wages of their parents, of the adults. So unless you are able to bring about an increase in the adult wages, you don't find a reduction in the incidence of child labor. So why, however, did the brands or in the value chains, why did they bring about these kinds of changes? The factors which seem to have worked are, one is media pressure, which led to private or public regulation. And the other is linked with media pressure, of course, is that of movements, particularly in the North, like the Students Against Sweatshops and others of those of the moral consumers. So these are some of the factors, but along with that, the biggest factor is the growth of education. When India made education compulsory, not quite compulsory, but anyway, partly compulsory and free up to the age of 14, that helped in a big way to reduce the extent of child labor. So there's a strong link between the universalization of education and the ending of child labor. So that is there all through history. So therefore, it's what I mentioned now is that it is necessary to go beyond interventions in the value chain and look at the supply of child labor. For that, we must take up what are called development interventions that affect the supply side. One of them is the making education compulsory. Another is increasing the adult wage. By the way, there are instances in history where even where education had not been made compulsory, the children nevertheless were sent to school or educated. And that was in Japan, where even before they introduced compulsory education, for some reason, there was a strong value placed on children's education, and that led to a universal education even before it was made legally required to be so. So in India, what we have seen is that very important in ending child labor is the aspirations that parents have for their children. I have heard parents tell me, we don't want in some Indian language or the other, we don't want our children to be fools like we are. We don't want them to go to the bus stand and not even know which bus is going where and have to ask somebody and look very foolish. So they want their children to be different from themselves. So that aspiration to be different is an important thing, which is not just a matter of regulation, but is a matter of a cultural transformation, along with the, as I mentioned, legal actions with regard to situations, whether it is in global value chains or domestic value chains, where children are employed as wage employees, usually at almost for nothing, but just for their food and shelter. The second is the compulsory education. The third is an increase in adult wages and related development interventions. Along with that, a change of aspirations. So thank you. That's the end. I end with that.
Thank you so much, Dave. Roseanne is the discussant. Roseanne there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dave, for that paper. It was such a joy to read. You could just tell all these years of working on the ground just gave really beautiful, rich empirical insights throughout the paper. So I thought that was fantastic. And I was really struck by your central argument, this idea that we have to move beyond, treating the symptoms, but really look at treating the cause of what drives child labour. So I just want to make a couple of points, and then there was one question I had just for clarification. But one of the things that really struck me when I read the paper was the invisibility of care and care labour throughout global value change generally, but really in your discussion when you were talking about children and these nowhere children, what really struck me was the fact that capitalism, as we know, is sustained by the processes of social reproduction, but we really see that here when you give these examples of children, particularly girls, labouring at home and doing these domestic tasks to allow their parents to work. And so I wondered if more could be said in your paper about this invisibility of caring or effective labour, because it strikes me that we do have a care crisis, and the care crisis is a global problem, and it's not unconnected to the problems of value chains. I'm thinking here in particular of Anne Stewart's work, where she brings together ideas of care and the market and the global economy and shows how you've got these interconnections. Obviously, the care crisis is played out differently when you're looking at the global north compared to less economically advantaged regions. So in the global north, what we're experiencing are social models based on a male breadwinner model, which doesn't exist anymore. And then we have a care deficit, which is then being supported with migrant care labour from less economically advantaged regions. But your description of these nowhere children and how they are supporting care in India and propping up these capitalist systems of production, I just thought was really powerful, and I think that could be illuminated further. So that was something I thought perhaps you could think about, just using that care analysis and talking more about how caring essentially is or capitalism is being sustained by care. The second main point I had was I completely accept the idea of increasing the adult wage. The provocation I would have would be, so how do we do that? And this is where I thought there were real parallels between your work and the paper we heard earlier from Chandan and Chinmay, where they gave an example of how we could move to a position of supporting workers in a much more sustainable way. So I wasn't sure what you would have in mind in terms of increasing the adult wage. Is this something where you're asking that we should have a default living wage? Is it an increase in welfare payments or the establishment of a system of welfare payments? Is it redistributive practices for companies? So I wondered if more could be said about that. And then finally, just the point of clarification I had was your table at page 12, when you talk about the rates or the percentages of child labour, there was a real reduction when you look at the first period in the 90s and then you look at the second period in 2007, 2008. It looked as if the rates or percentages had halved, and then you've still to fill in the column for the present situation. And so I just wondered if you could add a little bit of commentary about that and about what you say in your postscript about the fact that that rate of change is probably not going to continue. But I just wondered if a little bit of clarification could be included there. But thank you, Dev. I thought it was a great paper.
Thank you. Dave, you want to respond?
Well, I could do that. First, the question of care work, I agree. We need to bring care work into global value chains. And the first way of doing that is to ask for the inclusion of the valuation of care work as part of the calculation of a living wage. It's now not really part of it, but I know the Asia Floor Wage Alliance and also, Richard Anker and Martha Anker, who used to be with the ILO, they have all worked on this. And the Asia Floor Wage Alliance has a clear position that care work should be part of the living wage. So that's the first point that's to be made. That's the only way we can go about bringing an end to this child labor in this manner. Second, of course, it's needed is that there be some kind of care facilities set up. I mean, you cannot have this set up privately. It's too expensive for the workers at the bottom of the wage scale to be able to manage private care work unless they can bring an older relative, woman relative, to stay with them. But otherwise, you can't get it. So it's very important to be able to have that first. Second, how to bring this about is a huge issue. And I don't think I would take it up over here. As I said, we have, well, I'll just mention this. We have taken this question of how the value chains do not bring care work into the calculation of wages or into the wages they pay. You know, most of the global value chains, particularly for the labor-intensive ones like garments and leather products, etc., are really based on minimum wages, which are way below living wages. So this is a way of a subsidy, because somebody somewhere is paying for that difference between the living wage and the actual wage they're getting. It might be the young girl who's not able to go to school because her mother must go and work in the garment factory. So somebody is paying for that. And we call this a reverse subsidy. Reverse subsidy in two ways. One is it is taken from the poorest sections of workers in the value chains. Secondly, the benefit of that goes not to the manufacturers, because they are in this monopsony relationship with the brands, but it is captured by their brands because of their power in the bargaining situation with the suppliers. So it really goes to add to profits and accumulation in the global north. That's why we call this a reverse subsidy. How to change this? This is the big problem which I've posed in that paper on global monopsony. I mean, it's not an easy job. It's a massive task we have before us, but there are ways and we have to see how to move towards it. Yesterday, I mentioned that the ILO's Maritime Labour Convention is very important for us to look at, because it is one that actually has tried to solve this problem along with a implementation mechanism. That's something we should all try and see. Can it not be taken up in other industries too? Finally, the point about, yes, there is a higher reduction in the extent of child labor when there is relatively fast growth of the economy. But when they slow down, we find that there is the reduction in child labor also falls. I was also surprised recently when doing a little more work on child labor. The ILO UNICEF data shows a very odd trend that Sub-Saharan Africa, child labor incidence fell very drastically, but in the last period, 2016 to 2020, it actually increased. And when I asked friends at the UNICEF Research Center, they said, nobody knows why this is happening. Our best guess is that it could be because of better reporting. That's a possibility. But we know that there have been slowdowns, and surely in this pandemic, we can be sure there's a massive increase in child labor. It's very visible all over India. And I mean, there are children who are working, there are children who are begging, and there are young girls being married off at a very early age. So all of this is happening. And really the pandemic has brought about a huge crisis for child labor. There's no schools going on for 1.5 years. The children are playing in the fields or they're going and working in the fields. And so we really have a problem of being set back at least 10 years in the movement to end child labor by the recession of this last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dev. Hila?
Sorry, thank you, Dev, for this fascinating paper and presentation. I think it really expands the horizon of some of the discussions we had so far, because it looks at the policies of the governments of the developing world where supply chain work happens. And I think this is, I have a colleague called Ayushman Bhagat. He talks about what he calls destination bias, the way the literature, either because many scholars are actually located in the global north, or because there's the sense that the developmental state is too weak to take on policies, that there's a large focus on the governments of the global north and on lead firms because of their excessive power. And I think this paper is so interesting because while totally, admitting to the power of lead firms and Global North in this, and as you just said, the reverse subsidies and all of that, you're also saying, but let's look beyond the chain. And I think this is something that Prabha Kutiswaran, that was with us in the first conference, also does in her a developmental approach to human trafficking, that I see that you mentioned in your paper as well, where she tries to say, when we try to ask how to end the problem of human trafficking, she's not talking about child labor, but I think it's along a similar vein. She says, well, we really need to look beyond the narrow exploitation situation to the root causes, to the background conditions. And as you said, adult wages, children's education are all really create that environment and create the situation that enables it. So I think I really appreciated it. And I wondered if you could say something about, again, I'm not taking you to the idea of how to make this happen, where the solution, we know that's too big of a question perhaps, but to kind of reflect on the question of destination bias and demanding from suppliers, from the developmental state more, or whether your analysis eventually leads us to expansive lead firm responsibility through, for example, providing care, as we just said, or providing higher wages for adults, right? These are the people who provide the wages, or these are the entities responsible for wages. So that's my question. And thank you very much for this.
If I can just say 2 words about this. Yes, I do agree the question of responsibility is very important of the lead firms in this, because they are the ones who make the profits. They are the ones who drive, they run the chain. That is why I'm calling it monopsony capitalism. They are the ones who are running this world. So that's why it's important. There is a joint responsibility. The suppliers and supplier governments also have a responsibility in terms of making education compulsory, etc. But the point is, there is a differentiated responsibility. There is a much greater responsibility from the lead firms compared to the suppliers and the governments over there. There's a strong constraint of what the suppliers can do, which is brought about by the prices that are paid for the garments or other commodities that they manufacture. I mean, if your way of calculating wage costs in the contract is on minimum wages, how much can the suppliers increase it beyond minimum wages? Without, they can do a little bit, and which hopefully it'll increase their productivity. But if you want to really change the system and move in another direction, we'll have to have a new global social compact, which will require that in all global value chain type of production, the living wages should be the base for the wage system, and therefore the base for calculating supplier prices. So we need a very, very big change to bring that about.
Thank you so much, Dave. We are just about time, and you're really amazing. Any other thoughts, anyone, or should we just have a quick open house generally? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.